I'm with Bronwen Maddox, the director of Chatham House, one of the UK's oldest think tanks, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. I'm Jyoti Malhotra. This is South Asia Matters, and I'm in Delhi with Ms. Maddox. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed.
So the first question to you is about Chatham House. We've heard the phrase all our lives, and it's not just a proper noun, but it's also a verb. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Chatham House was set up in 1919, immediately after the First World War, in that spirit of never again can we bring rational thinking, even scientific thinking, to the world's worst problems and try and make them a bit better. And that's very much the spirit that's gone on. And the famous Chatham House rule some years later was that you can say anything you learn in a meeting, but you can't attribute it to any person or organization.
Okay, so now these are not Chatham House
rules. These are not Chatham House rules.
We are right in front of this camera, and you're on Awaaz, South Asia. But Ms. Maddox, tell me about, the world is going through so much. We have the Israel-Hamas war on the 7th of October. We know that the Hamas attacked Israel and several hundred people were killed. What's your view from London?
It is an immensely unstable time in the world, and everyone recognizes that, whether or not you use this new phrase, polycrisis, or not. And I think, some of this instability does generate more instability, either because countries are opportunistic, they see the world in turmoil, and they think now is their moment to take some advantage, or just because the uncertainties are triggering others. So we have a very difficult economic year coming up for many countries. High oil price, American growth slowing, Chinese growth slowing, and a very difficult political year for lots of countries with lots of elections around the world.
But whose side are you on? Whose side is the UK on?
Well, Chatham House is not the UK. I should make that absolutely clear. The Chatham House does not have its own ringing gears.
Policy think tank.
Yes.
So whose side is the UK on?
I think the UK now, particularly after Brexit, is positioning itself, obviously as part of the West, if you want to use that term, close to the US, but not identical with the US anymore. The scars of Iraq are very much there. And so, for example, on China, the UK has gone to great lengths to say, we want to talk to China, as well as keep some space to talk about human rights. So it's not in the same position as the US.
So a couple of questions. You said the scars of Iraq are very much there. I remember being in London in 2003 when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and there was all these big protests against the impending joining by the UK of the coalition that finally invaded Iraq. But nothing came of it. So it's 10 years later. Are you saying that people are regretting joining that coalition?
Oh, we're 20 years later. And I think a lot of people do. And you certainly get government ministers saying, look, that really did not work. And going in side by side with the US, as Tony Blair made a big point of doing, that is something I think British governments would be very careful about doing again. So there is more wariness. A lot of eagerness, as always, to say the US is our biggest ally, but a lot of wariness about doing something in lockstep with the US unless the UK makes its own argument for it, as it has in Ukraine.
But what about Palestine? Do you think the invasion of Gaza, which seems imminent, do you think the UK is on board with that?
I think the UK is going to be quite careful about what it says as a government. It is said very quickly, look, we're completely behind Israel and its right to respond. But there are also a lot of voices in the UK, and the opposition government, the Labour Party, has already moderated its views on this, because there are a lot of people very concerned about the humanitarian questions that may follow.
Now, Rishi Sunak, who's of Indian origin, of course, and I'm going to talk about that later, but he lands in Israel with a basket full of arms behind him. That's not a man who's carrying the message of peace, surely.
That is a man who is carrying the message of supporting Israel in its right to respond.
So the message
to what
of
Hamas
war.
has done. The message is responding to what Hamas has done. I'm not here to defend the British government, but I can, relay what it seems to be saying in that. But there is also an enormous concern among the British public about the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza.
And lots of protests on the streets.
Yes, there are. Some for Israel, quite a lot for the Palestinian cause. Though the police have said if you're actually going to support Hamas, which is a banned terrorist group in the UK, then no, we will crack down on that.
But you were saying earlier, you were telling me about this lovely anecdote about how the police and protesters are or how the police is going to deal with these protests that are taking place.
Well, the police have come under a lot of questions of why are you not cracking down, for example, on people chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is one of the big pro-Palestine chants. And they've said, look, this is thousands of people chanting this, and we cannot immediately, classify that as a hate crime. We need more guidance from the government. Yes, we will crack down on hate crimes and support for Hamas, but we actually need quite a lot of discussion about what crosses the line and what doesn't.
So the police is still wary. They don't want to crack down on these protesters.
Not on people protesting for Palestine. I think the government has also been very keen to make a distinction between people, very few people you can find who support Hamas, but people supporting a Palestinian cause more widely. But they also want people who are of Jewish origin in the UK to feel safe and not threatened by all this.
So tell me, Ms. Maddox, do you feel that there is increasingly a divergence between public opinion and the government in power on this question?
No, it's very fluid. We're speaking after just barely more than a week of this.
Right.
It's very fluid. I mean, what there is a lot of upset, people, a lot of shock, a lot of people reaching into years of upset on this particular subject. I think you could just say the opinions on all sides are pretty fluid.
And especially as innocent people, children, men, women, children are being killed, right?
But there's reports of very high death toll already on the Palestinian side, as well as obviously the initial Israeli death toll from the Hamas attacks. And there is concern around the world that if Israel goes further into Gaza, mounts a real military invasion of that there will inevitably be a lot of civilian deaths.
Do you think that the West, the UK, the US, do you think they're holding on to sort of Netanyahu's hand and telling him to slow down?
That's what you hear from reports. I'm not in a position to say whether or not that is the case. I think they've both backed, both Rishi Sunak and Joe Biden have backed Israel's right to respond to this horrendous attack by Hamas. But I think for both their reasons, they don't want to see, particularly the US, don't want to see an escalation of this conflict. And if there are a lot of civilian deaths in Gaza, that is one of the things that could escalate this conflict.
So why do you think that the US wants to, on the one hand, Biden has asked for more money from the government, from Congress to support the war. But you think that he would like it to end sooner than later? I mean, anybody would, of course, but why do you think he would be doing this?
I think Biden doesn't want this war to escalate. That's different from ending very soon. I think he really is backing Israel's right to respond to this attack on it and responding very much to Israeli public opinion. But what he doesn't want is this to inflame the West Bank and for Hezbollah, waiting on call, if you like, in Lebanon to mount a third front of attack, or second front, on Israel in a way that leaves Israel very, very stretched and begins to bring the US perhaps into a conflict with Iran.
So when you say that the Americans and the UK and many countries in the West believe that Israel has a right to respond, what does that mean?
It's a very good question, and there's no single ringing answer. A country that is the recipient of the target of a horrendous attack like this on its people, on its own security. Many countries agree it has the right to respond and go after the perpetrators of that attack. Then you get into much more complicated arguments about what is the nature of that response, what is justified.
And but we don't know whether that includes a military invasion.
Military invasion is a phrase that covers all kinds of things. So would it cover the pursuit of the Hamas leaders? Yes, by most interpretations of international law. What if that accidentally kills civilians? There you get into more difficult territory. What if that begins to kill large numbers of civilians? Again, more difficult territory. So there is intense debate about what is meant by international law, and then what Israel's freedom of movement is.
What do you think?
I think Israel has no good options. in this. It also has the question of the hostages, and Israeli, opinion is very febrile on this. Is Israel going to pursue the retrieval of those hostages as it has always done before, or is it going to say, look, we cannot get them back while pursuing Hamas leaders? We cannot be sure of getting them back. It has no good options, but I think if it invades Gaza in a way that causes a lot of civilian deaths, it makes what is a horrendous position for Israel potentially even worse.
And Israel probably recognizes that.
I think the care that it seems to be taking over whether or not to go in is a sign that it recognizes the complexity of this decision. It's not an easy decision. The question, also, as the US, Joe Biden has explicitly reminded Israel, if you go in, what then? As he has said, and I was surprised he said this, the US went into Iraq and Afghanistan, and that didn't go as planned. When you go in, you can take out the leaders sometimes, but what then? And that question is hanging over the whole operation at the moment.
So you're surprised that Joe Biden talked about Iraq and Afghanistan?
Yes, I am. That he talked about the failure, I didn't quite use that word, but that these enormous US endeavors did not go the way the US expected, that the world's most powerful military force did not get by military means what it expected there. And I was surprised because it undermines what Joe Biden, who prides himself on his command of foreign affairs, it undermines what he wants to do as president, which is to retain a degree of America's ability to act in the world. And we're speaking at a time, as we can see from Congress, US Congress, when many Americans are thinking, we don't want to be so active in the world. We don't want to lose American lives, American money, to be the world's policeman. We're going to retreat, look after our own interests. That was part of Donald Trump's appeal. And Biden doesn't quite want to be boxed into that, as we can see in his battles with Congress to get money for Ukraine, now Israel.
Right.
So acknowledging that things don't always go right overseas was very honest of him.
Very honest, and also a very realistic appreciation of the ground reality.
Yes, but realism doesn't always play well in politics.
Especially when it's an election year.
As it is, and everything in America needs to be considered as part of an election year. A really unusual one, in that we may have this repeat of Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, but it is an election year.
And what do you think?
Donald Trump is in a very strong position, which I think other countries need to consider very seriously, because to me, it changes perhaps the way we look at the world and look at American democracy if Trump wins again. Not just because he's Donald Trump, with all the theatre and the unpredictability that we got to know about from his first term, but because it would mean that so many millions of Americans shared Donald Trump's view, apparently, that the last election was stolen, his word, and supported his methods of contesting that election, including perhaps the riots at the Capitol building. And that really says something quite troubling about America's democracy. Certainly the UK's foreign policy has been built for a long time on the sense that the US always remains the US. Presidents come and go, and they have different preferences, and some keen on military action, others not. But the US always stands by its belief in its own democracy. And I think you get something very different if Americans vote to put Donald Trump back in, a man who may be a convicted felon at that point, but also a man who has said the democracy is not working except when it produces me.
Why do you think the Democrats haven't been able to find an alternative to Biden? He is, more than 80 years old. He seems physically infirm. You see that on television. Why do you think?
Yes, he's only a few years older than Donald Trump. So Donald Trump doesn't attack him on his age, just on his apparent infirmity, which, as you describe, is visible. And Democrats are uneasy about that. It's very difficult to produce new contenders in the American political system, certainly against an incumbent. The risk of jumping from one to another and of undermining the president, which should be an advantage for the party, having the president, the moment. That is seen as considerable. There has been talk about whether the party could have looked for an alternative vice president, but Kamala Harris is, while not hugely popular, has been a steady figure by his side, and again, it's quite hard to change that position. So I think it's, in a way, harder for them to get contenders compared to the Republicans, who have a large field, even if Donald Trump is by far in the lead.
And then you have the unelected Prime Minister of Britain, Rishi Sunak. How is he doing?
Rishi Sunak is doing fairly well as a technocratic Prime Minister.
Mm-hmm.
His party is not doing particularly well. I think there is a common assumption, confirmed by every single opinion poll that comes out, that the Labour opposition led by Sir Keir Starmer is likely to be the next government, overwhelmingly likely at this point. And so Rishi Sunak has the difficult job of trying to make some inroads into that, trying to make it seem as if the election is contestable, and trying to get things done as well. And he's made some abrupt changes to policy which have surprised people, to do with green policies on cars and household heating, which make the party look less green. He says, no, the targets are, absolutely right. We adjust these targets because they're not practical. Again, the technocrat speaking, if you like. Mm-hmm. He has a point, but it was confusing politics. He's grappling with all the debt that the country took on during the pandemic. The things that he has done very well, particularly before he became Prime Minister, during the pandemic, are sort of forgotten, but he did get money very quickly to people who needed it and to support businesses. And I think the UK would have suffered more during the pandemic if Rishi Sunak as Chancellor hadn't done that. But that is in the past, and now he is dealing with the consequences as Prime Minister, which is a country that does not have as much money as the voters would like the government to spend.
So what's the latest on this controversial piece of legislation on immigration? And as the Conservative Party in your country basically said, he has said it himself, Sunak, and then what's her name, Suella Braverman.
It is her name, yes.
Now, it's odd because both these people have been immigrants at some point of time. I mean, their families at least have been. Rishi Sunak was born in the UK, but his parents came from East Africa and before that from India. So isn't that hypocritical?
He and Suella Braverman, I think, repeatedly say, no, look, the UK needs many, many immigrants, but we need to be able to choose which ones those are and choose them by deals with particular countries, for example, India. What he is grappling with is politically is the number of people coming illegally, for example, in small boats across the Channel. This is where the political heat is. Mm-hmm. Actually, the battle within the government is between the Treasury and Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, because the Treasury, Rishi Sunak, having been at the Treasury, having been Chancellor, is very much knows that mentality. The country needs many immigrants to keep growing. Would like them to be educated and skilled, but it does need many immigrants. And now it has shut off, since Brexit, quite a few of those coming from the European Union. Mm-hmm. So it must get them from somewhere. And actually the legal immigration goes below the political radar, and it's much, much bigger than the illegal migration. But the illegal migration is where the political heat is.
So you don't think that it's imminent? There's an imminent sort of resolution to that.
No, I don't. It's in the courts where the governments wish to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda. That bit is with the courts at the moment.
And what happens to Ukraine in the middle of this Israel-Hamas-Palestine crisis?
You know, it's revealing that we have now, in this conversation, got to Ukraine.
Finally, after 15 minutes.
And that is Ukraine's problem.
That's right.
Is that all kinds of other things have suddenly thrust themselves up the agenda. And Ukraine has been fighting a war for public attention and public support, as well as a war with Russia. And it's suddenly, despite President Zelensky's brilliance at getting the world's attention, and getting that support, it is struggling, because suddenly the attention is on the Middle East. And he's making what I still personally think are very good arguments, that Ukraine is everyone's war, because it is about the rights of sovereignty of a country not to be invaded and taken over. It's about democracy, the rights of people to choose their own government. And it if Russia wins in any sense, it can sit there, destabilize Europe, and just wait till the world is distracted again before doing something else on another country, Moldova or even the Baltic states. I think these are all good arguments, as well as the justice for Ukrainians who are fighting for their country. But he needs a constant supply of arms from other countries, and really he needs the US.
And the US is distracted.
The US is distracted, and even before the Israel-Hamas conflict erupted, before Hamas attacked Israel, the US Congress was beginning to say we're not so keen on giving money to Ukraine, at least the Republicans were, and American public support in polls was falling for keeping engaged in Ukraine. So that is a worry, because the US has given more financial and other support than the whole of Europe plus the UK combined.
But so people are getting a bit tired of Zelensky, I mean, despite the fact that...
I think they're getting, Americans specifically, are getting tired of supporting what they call forever wars. And this is where the history of Iraq and Afghanistan comes in. In the UK, support for Ukraine and Ukrainians is still very strong. Many people have taken Ukrainians into their own homes. One of the government ministers, Grant Shapps, has done that. And you still can go to neighbourhood gatherings on Sunday evenings and see huge fundraising for ambulances to Ukraine and so on. There's a lot of support, but Ukraine is closer to the UK and feels closer than it does in the US.
So, but Putin, the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, seems to be, for the moment at least, as the rest of the world is distracted by the Israel-Palestine or Hamas issue, you know, his country, Russia and China, have come together at the Security Council to fight the good fight on Israel-Palestine, basically saying let's have peace, and the Americans are vetoing that. Doesn't that look a bit odd to the rest of the world?
It's such a complex picture, the Israel-Palestinian question. I think, you know, countries' positions are well known of who they've supported down the decades. What is becoming clearer out of this is many countries feeling that there is never going to be peace if there isn't some kind of deal and discussion coming out of this that recognizes Israel's need for security, but also the Palestinians' need for land and security of their own.
You think there's an increasing recognition and appreciation for that?
I think there is. I don't think that immediately turns into a roadmap, to use that famous word, of how to get there.
Right.
But if the alternative is that there is possibly never peace, and I'm thinking of what one British ambassador wrote on leaving the Middle East, one possibility is that there is never peace, but no one wants that. And I can absolutely see the force of the argument that if there is going to be peace, it needs eventually to rest on some kind of political settlement, not just a military solution.
So how do you look at the Russia-China, the leaders of Russia and China, Putin and Xi Jinping, coming together increasingly? Do you see this again, the world being divided up into two blocks, the West versus the non-West, shall we say?
Not that neatly. Nothing is neat about the world we're in at the moment. I'm not even sure that Russia and China are that close. They certainly...
You recognize that?
Yeah, they certainly identify themselves as against the US, Russia particularly loudly, and China is very conscious of trying to detach itself from this. But I'm not sure, for example, over Ukraine, that China and Russia are really that close. The invasion was an embarrassment to China, I think. It likes its dependent countries to act dependent, not suddenly go and start new wars. So I'm not sure it was that comfortable with it. And Russia, having started this conflict, it would now like Russia to win in some sense and finish it. It's quite revealing that Russia had to go to North Korea to talk about weapons supplies, not China itself. So I don't think you've got wholehearted support there. But in terms of positioning themselves against the US, yes. But lots of countries are choosing this as a moment to say, look, it doesn't suit us to take sides. India, Brazil both explicitly looked at the Ukraine conflict that way and said, we are going to calculate our own interests and allegiances and alignments, even if they're not alliances. We're going to calculate them for ourselves.
But isn't that interesting? I mean, you mentioned India and Brazil, and India sort of took the middle path or tried to take the middle path between Russia and the US on the Ukraine invasion. How do you see this from London?
I think it was a reminder that India wants to make its own positions, that it will choose its own positioning in every case.
But the Americans weren't happy at all about it, and they said so publicly.
Yes, but the US is having to acknowledge, I think, that many countries are free to choose their own positions, and that those may vary from conflict or difficult negotiation to another.
And would that mean that the US is a far weaker power today, and that's why it has to acknowledge these needs of these other
It's a good
countries?
question. I think it is and it isn't. I mean, in many ways it is still very, very powerful militarily, economically, but the world is much more complicated and it's stickier diplomatically. Everything takes a lot more persuasion, even for the US. You can't just say, we're going in this direction, other countries, please follow. The UK, as I've said, more careful about rushing to align itself with the US on things.
The UK,
Yes.
in what way? Give me an example.
On China, the Foreign Secretary's statement, James Cleverly, a big speech back in the spring, was very different from the American positioning on China, which is very hawkish, very much China as a threat. It didn't call China a threat. It said we have to talk to it, and some global problems like climate change can only be solved by talking to China. And we want to trade with China, we want cultural exchange, we want to tell China our views on human rights, and we do not want to see China's aggression. So it was balanced, it was having it many different ways at once, but it was really not the US's position. And the UK did agree finally to push Huawei out of its 5G network after considerable US pressure, but it took a lot of pressure and persuasion.
So, the last couple of questions on China. You just said that the UK is taking a far more sophisticated position on China than the Americans are. So why are the Americans, are they sort of insecure that China is the second largest world economy and rapidly going to become the top economy in the world in 4 or 5 years? Is there a nervousness there?
The UK, to me, is taking a nuanced position, a many-sided position, not necessarily more sophisticated.
Okay.
I think the US is right, in a way, from its point of view. China is a threat in the sense that China represents a completely different way of organizing relations between people. Its leaders and its officials are very explicit about that. It thinks its way is better. And it is using its surpluses to recruit many countries, if not to be warm allies, at least to be fellow travelers or supporters. And that is a threat to US interests in the way the US has formed its alliances in the past. You know, they're fond of saying in the UK Foreign Office that the US is worried about what China is, and other countries like the UK are worried about what China does. And I think that distinction is I'm not sure the Americans would agree, but there is a rationale for it from the US point of view. China is a challenge, not necessarily an active military threat all the time, but it is a real challenge to the US.
And, India and China have this, for the last few years, especially since Chinese troops have shown up on the line of actual control, have this odd sort of relationship. But trade has gone up, not just between India and China, but between China and the UK, China and the US. So do you think that's one of the reasons that moderates the behavior of countries, which is that you continue to buy so much from the Chinese, but you have to, politically or strategically, you have to say different things?
This is such an interesting point. I mean, the US and India, in a way, have become close allies because they have a common interest in holding China at bay and containing China. But China is so integrated into the world economy. India, absolutely, where you say trade is rising, integrated into the US economy. I think there is very little that can be shut out economically. For all the talk of decoupling, yes, you can shut out on both sides access to sensitive technology, to military things. You can shut down some kinds of cultural exchange, for example, students. But when you get down to consumer technology, phones, children's toys, all kinds of things, this is so extensive that really I think it would take a big spike in hostilities and tension to make inroads into that. Yes, countries are pulling back. I see a lot of companies looking at whether they can relocate production to India or Vietnam instead of China. But that's a slow transition.
And finally, how does the UK, or how do people in the UK look at the Narendra Modi government? They've been in power for 9 years. This is an election year coming up. How do you see this government?
I think people in the UK have a lot of questions. On the one hand, they see India's growth, very possibly, at least according to official figures, going to be bigger than China's growth this year. In a world where a lot of countries, including the UK, are struggling to get growth. On the other, they look at the reports of pressure on the media and so on, and wonder whether that changes the character of India's democracy. They listen to many Indian voices, as I've been doing this week, saying, look, you can overstate the pressures of the government, and every government is complex, and this is really a very complex story. But they have a lot of questions about, all the competing narratives about India. Which one is going to shape India for the future? It's been a big year for India, the G20, with the Modi visit to Washington. India has been very, very prominent on the world stage, so I think people welcome that. It's good to see India exercising its own voice, and reminds the whole world that there are alternatives to this tension between US, China, and Russia. It's a completely separate voice of its own making. But then people want to know, well, what is that voice going to say? And I think we will look a lot to the elections next year, to what the government and the opposition and the people running in the state elections, to see what they say.
Ms. Bronwen Maddox, thank you so much for speaking to me on South Asia Matters at Awaaz South Asia. Thank you so much for your time.